Good morning. I want to go over this new research report from the Society of Actuaries. It was actually done by Rick Levitt, who is an actuary. 2020 excess deaths in the U.S. general population by age and sex. Let's look at this nice PDF. And I'm only going to go over a few of the exhibits in here. A lot of this report is about how Rick Levitt developed the numbers that you see in this report because, as I've said before, the reporting is not complete for 2020. And it's not only because of North Carolina's 3-month lag due to reporting on paper still. In any case, I do want to explain some of the tables and exhibits that are in this study. So let's start with this table 1, actual to expected deaths. And let me explain this. He developed the expected number of deaths for 2020, basing this off of the population at each age group and what we expected the base mortality rate for that age group to look like for 2020. And then looked at, notice they did it from March 22nd to December 26th. So this excludes all of that normal mortality that was in January and February 2020, and actually most of March. We did get that initial spike in deaths starting at the end of March and then spiking in April 11th. And there was another wave starting at the end of the year, and we'll see that in a moment. So anything over 100% is going to be that there were more deaths than were expected for that period. And I wish they had just subtracted off 100% because that would be just a lot easier to look at. So for age 15 to 34, it was about a 20% excess mortality for that period. For 35 to 64, 25%. And then for greater than 64, again, about 20%. Okay, that's that column there. Then the next column are the number of COVID deaths divided by that expected number of deaths for that period. So basically, we're asking how much of the excess mortality is explained by official COVID deaths. So for 15 to 34, unsurprisingly, it's pretty low. It's 4%. For 35 to 64, it's about 13%. And for greater than 64, it's about 18%. Then we get our final column by subtracting off those COVID deaths. Notice, and I haven't been talking about it, under age 15, we have a number less than 100%. So mortality was actually down. And I've mentioned this before. Some of this may be due to most of the deaths for those who are children tend to be accidental causes. And that can be car accidents. Well, you're not driving around so much. The kids are home. They're not going to school. So they're not in any accidents. There's also a few other causes of death. Obviously, there were child deaths during the year. One of the other things that we saw that was down, this is not an appreciable cause of death for children, but pediatric flu deaths, I believe for this season, it's just one official pediatric flu death. And usually I think we get about 100 per year. Again, it's not the largest, I don't even think it's on the top 10 causes for childhood deaths, but just something to think about. Okay, so let's look at what's left after we take COVID out of the excess mortality. We see for all ages, we still have this residual 3%, but that's because we're averaging over the entire population. And so again, all ages about 20%, where 17% is COVID, 17 percentage points is COVID, and then 3% is left over, not explained directly by COVID. But as we can see, it differs by age group. For the seniors, there's not a lot of residual excess mortality, and that 2% may be a lot of undetected COVID. Could be. That said, for the younger adults, so 15 to 34, so young adults, there's still 16% excess mortality even after removing COVID, and 35 to 64, about 13%. So this report, just to get into it, all this is about quantifying the excess mortality for that period in 2020. It's not about explaining where that non-COVID mortality is coming from. There will be, over the years, I know there will be a lot of investigations into especially the heightened mortality for the younger adult population. I had already noticed this, and I've mentioned it in prior videos. There is a lot of excess mortality for those age groups that really aren't explained by COVID, and I don't think it's COVID undercounting. I think it's other stuff. There is various, even there are some statistics showing that opioid overdoses were up, and some others. Let me grab a few other things. I'm not going to do the group life survey. So completed, actual, and expected deaths by week, all ages and sexes, no breakout by race, or age or sex. So he has this curve, this dotted line of expected, and again, in the paper he explains how he develops the expected. So it's based off of what the population amounts are. Yeah, and some of this, again, we can see going into 2021, we see this fall off in total deaths, and this is because they're not really completed. Yes, he probably did complete the data that he had for those weeks, but those data are far from complete. And as I've mentioned before, a lot of this is probably still even going to go up for the end of 2020 because North Carolina is one of the top 10 largest states, and we don't have all their deaths, and we are missing quite a few of their deaths because of their antiquated death reporting system. Okay, so this dark blue is the whole deaths, and the purple are the COVID deaths that have been recorded. So this light blue is that excluding COVID deaths. And yes, again, that January 2021 is not credible in what's going on there. So what we see is in that first wave, there's a bunch of non-COVID, non-official COVID deaths. But I believe that first wave, that first spike, that's undercounted COVID because they didn't have the testing capacity. But by the time of the summer, the testing capacity was there. We have this general elevated, not really a spike. And we've seen this time and again, but notice that, for October and out, it's, the excess mortality seems to be primarily COVID. Here's more detailed and split out by male versus female COVID and non-COVID excess mortality. And again, I wish they had just, subtracted off the 100%. We would get negative numbers for all the ones under age 15. And then we would have, and we see double-digit percentage excess mortality ratios. And it's, it kind of goes up and down. It's around 20% excess mortality for all the age groups, but the portion of that's officially COVID is pretty small for younger adults. And pretty high for older adults, which is what we would expect. Another thing to note, okay, so we have female. Note for female versus male, the excess mortality. You have to remember, when we're doing this excess mortality, this actual to expected, the expected death rate for men is already higher than female. So when we see like 27% excess mortality for males age 45 to 54 versus 21% for females, this is already coming off of a heightened mortality for men that age group compared to women that age group. If we did a male to female mortality ratio, that'd be well over 1, and I can do that in another time, showing what that looks like. Okay, so it starts to get very noisy. And that's why he had to aggregate at these huge age groups. He can do it for these more detailed age groups for that whole period. And this is March 22nd to December 26, 2020. So you aggregate a lot of time, so then you can get more detail, for smaller age groups. But when you have to do it week to week, you do need to have a certain number of deaths for this to be kind of smooth. And that's why the curve that's the smoothest is the red one, which is the seniors greater than 64. For under age 15, there are so few deaths expected in that age group to begin with. There, you can see there's a lot of noise. It doesn't take a lot of extra deaths to make that ratio move around. What is interesting, again, is we see it depressed here in the spring, and then, it's nearish zero excess in the summer. So maybe, you're moving around again and the kids are in the car again. During the school weeks, they're at home on the computer, so they're not getting into car accidents. And then again, when school started back up in the fall, it's under 100% for the most part. So something to think about. Oh, I'm sorry, that was females, and here's males. Let's take a look at the males. Not too different, but we do see that childhood deaths really down, and some of it is we don't have the reported amounts yet. That's all. Okay, so I'm not going to do all of these. The bulk of this paper is how he did it. And there are some interesting things here, and I will do that in a different video. What's the takeaway? What do you need to know about this? One thing you really need to know, because people keep just trying to minimize this mortality impact. Mortality was raised for all of the adult groups for 2020 in that period that COVID was around. That said, it's mainly for the oldest age group that almost all of their excess mortality came from COVID. And it does seem like for young adults that like 15 to 34, a very small percentage came from COVID, and other things were driving excess mortality. Now, you have to remember that the death rate for 15 to 34 is very low to begin with. So when we're talking 20% excess mortality for 15 to 34, that's a lot fewer deaths than 20% excess mortality for over age 64. Because that's where most of the deaths come in any year, is over age 64. And I don't remember the percentage, don't ask me right now. It's interesting for 35 to 64, so the middle-aged adults, it's about 50-50 COVID and non-COVID for the excess mortality. So that's kind of interesting. But for seniors, almost all of their excess mortality is coming from COVID. That's the takeaway. More later.